Test, test, test. This is an interview with Dr Pradip Thomas at the University of Queensland School of Journalism and Communication on October the 26th, 2012. Dr Thomas, can you explain the four original models of journalism that seem to become popular after World War II in the 1960s? The ones that we have are libertarian, social responsibility, authoritarian, and there's also the communist model, which I guess we don't really need to discuss because we're talking about the Pacific region. How did all these models come to be and why?
The four theories of the press evolved around the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, and there were people like Wilbur Schramm, who was a great believer in the role of the media in development. And of course it evolved during a time when there was a need to professionalize the media. The media had become global. And so these theories accompanied the growth of media and the professionalization of the media. So the libertarian theory, for example, is based on the notion that the media should be free and that no one, neither the government or the commercial sector, should interfere in the practice of the media. Now, of course, if you look at it, it's a problematic model in some ways because you need to have some regulation, either self-regulation or regulation from the state. The social responsibility model is the one that is, I think, the most widespread today, and it makes sense because it is based on the belief that the media need to be responsible, and that that media practices should be based on a balance between rights and responsibilities. The other models, of course, the authoritarian model is normally connected to states that have an authoritarian political system where state media are all important. The communist model, of course, is part of that old Cold War, and the way in which the media world was divided into these two rather large blocks. So yeah, I mean, so these models are okay in theory, but in practice there were lots of variations.
Yes, I think you were also saying too that in maybe the late 50s and into the early 60s, journalism as a profession was becoming more like a profession in apostrophes, if you like. It was taking itself more seriously as a skilled pursuit. Is that another reason why suddenly we've got a bunch of models and theories that are intended to guide journalists who are professional journalists?
I think so. I think this was the kind of heyday of journalism in a sense, and really, I mean, if you really need to look at where it evolves from. It evolves from the West, basically, from the US and to some extent from Europe, and it was accompanied by certain notions. For example, the notion of objectivity, and the notion of objectivity means that a journalist ought to always be neutral in terms of his or her reporting of any given media event. Now, and of course, the notion of objectivity is connected to the notion of democracy, etc., etc. Now, that's all good in theory, but in practice, you can ask the question, can journalists ever be objective in their reporting, because it's such a subjective process? Even if you do have, even if the editor believes in objectivity, it's a tough kind of a thing to handle because of the fact that you are naturally, when you do report events, you take sides, and it's very difficult to remain objective, in the context of reporting all sorts of events. Whatever it is, it could be a political event, it could be a cultural event, it could be a social event. How can you be objective when you deal with terrorism, for example? It's a tough one. Different people report it in different kinds of ways. How do you, for example, report, say, Palestine-Israel situations? Can you ever be objective? So it really depends on where you're located, what your politics are, and therefore there are all these variations. And pure objectivity, therefore, is a myth, I think.
It's interesting because defenders of the Western style of journalism, which is tell me if I'm wrong, but is descended from that libertarian model, which is seen as a straight sort of investigative journalism that you might have found in the Watergate affair in the US, and in stories like that. That's about getting the basic facts right. Would not all journalism need to at least get the basic facts right?
Oh, I think so. I think they need to get the facts right. But I think journalism should not just be about facts, but also providing the context for those facts. I think one of the issues with journalism today is that, there's a lot of factual reporting, and of course there are lots of journalists who don't even get the facts straight. But the issue really today is about context, about placing those facts in context, and providing the reader with as much information as possible to understand an event. And that seems to be, that seems to be the gap, one of the major gaps in journalism today, because I think people are being pushed to report in the context of lots of commercial pressures, and they don't seem to have the space, nor in some cases the inclination to write about the context.
Yes, I mean, with the digital revolution, perhaps context is becoming even more important in content. Would you think so? Or?
I would think so. I think there's, I think with the digital revolution, there are a lot more possibilities for people to actually deal with that context. But again, in mainstream media, especially in the press, I think there are lots of pressures, and this whole business of dumbing down is a reality today. It doesn't matter whether you're in the West or the East or wherever you are. If you look at the press in general, you'll find that quite a lot of them actually prefer to go down that sensationalist route. And I think the Leveson inquiry in the UK with respect to Rupert Murdoch's news is a very good example of attempts to actually make the media responsible in terms of their reporting. Because really, at the end of the day, the media play an extraordinarily important role in our lives. They are really, they are involved in owning a very scarce resource, and that's information and communications about events. They are the media communicating ideas of what is good, what is bad, what is proper, what is improper, who is a terrorist, who is not, all these kinds of issues. And so the media is very much, it's not like any other product. It's not like, say, a biscuit where you eat a biscuit and that's it. You've got to go and buy another packet if you want some more. The media actually affects our consciousness, and that's what makes it a very, a different kind of, product. And that is why we take the media seriously. That's why we take the news seriously. That's why, we need to understand how media impacts on people's lives and people's understandings. That is key to understanding newspapers and the press. And that's why, we have this kind of a discussion.
Indeed. Well, I mean, swinging into the region, the Pacific region, this is a question. What models of journalism, or what theories or ways of journalism, of doing journalism, do you see currently being sort of practiced, whether people, working journalists, are aware that they're practicing these models or not, in the Pacific right now? Do we have sort of social responsibility versus Western journalism, or do we have, within the social responsibility family, there's peace journalism, there's development journalism, there's guided there's, a whole raft of different kinds of variations of journalism. What's out there? What's being done in the Pacific that you can see that's appropriate or even not appropriate for the news that occurs there?
I would think that most journalism in the Pacific, like everywhere else in the world, is either commercially motivated or politically motivated, and therefore, I think there's a dearth of social responsibility type journalism. So, while people use terms like peace journalism, development journalism, etc., I don't think there are very many examples of these. So you are bound to not. I think you might get the odd example of a small newspaper trying to practice this, but really, I think the Pacific is no different from any other part of the world where it's commercial, it's political, And I think at the end of the day, it's the audience that suffers because of the nature of journalism that is practiced.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, for a working journalist or a journalism student learning about the various ways of doing journalism, faced with a particular kind of story, I wonder if I could ask you what model, for instance, or what kind of technique a journalist would use. I mean, suppose there's a cyclone heading for a country. It's a natural disaster. Then it hits, the journalist covers that. Would they be using, is it too simplistic to say they'd have to use one kind or the other kind or some other kind of journalism? Would they use the Western straight fact-gathering, sort of technique, or would they use social responsibility? Would they be looking at, the impact of the cyclone on the poor? Or, and how would a journalist see in practice how they could apply these different ways of doing journalism when covering a story like that, which is, basically a disaster story?
I think in the context of the Pacific, of course, the Pacific, that context is very, very special. Journalism has to kind of cover, realities that are probably not covered in other parts of the world. So how does, for example, one, in the context of, say, a cyclone, cover that particular event? I mean, do you just write a straight piece, a factual piece on the cyclone? Do you actually provide information on where people ought to go to, in order for relief, in order to get more information? So where do you draw the line on these kinds of things? And that's going to be a judgment call. But I think, in places like the Pacific, journalists ought to, this should be secondhand. They should actually, when covering conflict or covering cyclones or whatever, really need to deal with, how people are impacted, real stories that come from that, from a cyclone situation, and also provide information on how best people can access resources, material resources, financial resources in the context of an event like a cyclone. But the other, of course, issue that I'd like to just quickly add is, how does journalists report an ethnic conflict? These are real issues, not only in the Pacific but other parts of the world, And this is where I think they have to exercise a certain responsibility, because you can take sides and you can fan flames. And in the context of the Pacific, like in other parts of the world, those, if you fan flames, it can really result in hatred. It can result in loss of life and limb, and those kinds of situations. And and I don't think journalists are, should be allowed to get away with those kinds of things. And this is where a certain ethics comes in. I think journalists in the Pacific, like everywhere else, must exercise a certain, their freedom in the context of local situations. They really, I think, should exercise responsibilities, and the responsibilities are extremely important, and they can't be ignored because of the types of situations that the journalists confront on a day-to-day basis.
So what sort of responsibilities should a journalist bear in the front of their mind when they're covering, say, an ethnic conflict?
I think they've got to be aware that reporting can fan the flames. At the same time, reporting can douse the flames. And I would say that that's what the journalists ought to be doing. They should be dousing the flames, making sure that people, all sides are heard, and they can all. This is where this peace journalism comes in. Where do you provide, for example, the context? Do you get people to the table? Do you actually try and push for a larger public opinion on these kinds of issues? Because at the end of the day, these kinds of conflicts, have created tremendous damage in these societies. And you can't go on like this. It's just irresponsible to go on like this, because it's ordinary people who suffer. It's not the people who foment these divides who suffer. It's ordinary people. And I think journalists have always have to keep in mind that they're there to play an extremely important role in society, and that's about mediating peace. It's about making sure that development happens, making sure that people's voices are heard, and in the context of conflict, it's really essential and really vital that they play that kind of role.
I mean, would that sort of role also apply when exposing corruption by government or the business sector?
I think so. I think these are tough issues, and of course, at the end of the day, journalists have to make, this is up to them really on how they're going to report corruption. It's easy for me to say that all corruption should be reported, and they ought to be. In an ideal world, they will be reported. But we live in a world which is complex. All sides, politicians, it doesn't matter which side they come from, they tend to get involved in corrupt deals. And you have to, the editor needs to make a choice on those kinds of stories. So while on the one hand I believe that journalists are there to do proper investigative reporting, there are probably good reason for not covering a certain issue, especially if that is going to affect journalism as a practice, right? So I think this is a judgment call that editors have and editorial groups have to make. But at the end of the day, I think all news media should be involved in exposing corruption and making sure that the public benefits. At the end of the day, I think when you talk of corruption, it's about taxpayers' money. It's about monies being swollen up by individuals when actually it should benefit the community. So I think newspapers are there. I strongly believe that this watchdog role is an important role. It's not the only role for the media, but there are occasions when they have to rise up and be a watchdog to society.
So in the end, sort of isolating different theories like Western versus development versus is a bit simplistic.
I think
perhaps
so.
in practice, would you think?
So. I think at the end of the day, there's no Western and Eastern theories, media theories. It's about how do you cover an event, how honest are you about covering that event, how truthful are you, and it's those kinds of issues that are fundamental. And I really think that we are living in an age, a digital age, where you can say that print and print copies physically, printed copies, they have limitations because there's limitations of space, etc., etc. Today you can't argue that. When it's online, you can provide as much context as possible. Are you doing that? And that's the kind of issue that needs to be posed.